we are also going to talk about free motion quilting today, which is when you take your quilt top and with your machine in a specific format, you move your fabric so that you design a quilted pattern on it in the way you move your fabric. Stippling is a big free motion quilting pattern that people use. I'll have a picture of that in the blog post. Loopy quilting is my personal favorite, where it's just kind of big loops that go in rows across the quilt. And the great thing about the New Star quilt with doing loopy quilting is you already have these rows made of squares that you can keep the loops within, or have loops go across 2 rows to make larger loops. So it's really great to quilt a pattern that is in a row format on a quilt like the New Star quilt, because you don't have to make any grid lines or marks to guide you. You already have the seams of the quilt. So we're gonna walk you through what free motion quilting is. In free motion, I'm gonna do on some small quilt sandwiches on our machine that I recommended for beginner quilters, the Janome Mod 30. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about hand quilting. I'm a novice hand quilter. I do it my own way. I've done some research in terms of right techniques and things, but I'll show you how I personally hand quilt my quilts. And I typically use like a floss or a perler cotton, a thicker thread, because I personally like to see a large, big stitch for my hand quilting. A lot of people will use just regular quilting thread as well. Some of the tools you might need for this week are, of course, your machine. For free motion quilting on the machine, you will need a free motion quilting foot. That's something you'll have to purchase additional based on what machine you're using. Some machines come with those, some do not. And then lastly, if you want to practice, you can practice by making a quilt sandwich with 2 pieces of fabric and a piece of batting, cutting it to a smaller size that you would make maybe into a pillow or into a pouch later, basting it just like I showed you last week, and you can practice on those on your domestic machine for quilting before you dive into your quilt. No shame either way. Practice or dive straight in. It is not too difficult. It just, like everything, takes a little bit of time and practice to get it right. So check out the rest of this video and get some tips and tricks. So this is free motion quilting. Can you see the curve of the stitches here and how I continue across? It's a little bit tricky on this because I do have thick foam, so I skipped some stitches there, I think because of the thickness as opposed to the free motion quilting. But this machine is free motion quilting. You do have to purchase a outside free motion quilting foot. This is what it looks like. Now I am using a different one that is very similar, but it's open between, like this has 2 little lines there and it's closed. The one I'm using is open, and I like that better personally. Again, you screw it onto the shaft with this little spot here and the screw that comes, and this little piece goes above your screw coming out from the side of the needle, just like on the walking foot. What this foot looks like, as you can see, it's more of a C shape and it's open in the front. That's my personal preference for a quilting foot. And you can see up here, and hopefully you can see from this angle, that we have this little bit of metal above the screw that holds the needle in. And that way your foot goes up and down as your needle goes up and down, which is what helps it have the free motion, because you don't want the pressure from the foot to hold the fabric in place and not be movable. And the only other thing you need to do for free motion quilting is lower your feed dogs. That's the little treads underneath, right, that we talk about they feed the fabric through. On this machine on the back, there is a button that you push side to side to lower them. And on any machine, it'll be some sort of a button to tell you how to lower them. You can also see here, these are the feed dogs, and they're in the down position, so they are underneath this plate. I'm going to push them back up, and let's see if we can see them move. So it may take a moment for them to kind of pop back up, but it happens more as it's sewing. They come up above the plate. And when you're not sewing, they're kind of level with the plate. But when the feed dogs are down, they're going to be fully underneath the plate so you can move the fabric freely at will. So with free motion quilting, we'll look at it from this vantage point. I might switch you to the other side, but then we'll look at it from above. You are moving the fabric through, so how much you move the fabric determines how long your stitch length is, as well as your pattern. Okay, let's try from this view because I felt like the other view I was going to bump you over here. So I finished with this row of loops, and the great thing about the new Star Quilt is because it is in squares, you can keep your loops within one square or at least one row of squares. But I want to come down to this next row that I'm going to do, and I'm just kind of eyeballing, and I am the one moving the fabric now. The machine is not moving the fabric for me. So that's the difference with free motion quilting. Anytime I move the fabric, it is going to move the needle and make stitches in that spot. And this machine, I do have to say, for free motion quilting, I 100% want that needle to stop down. So you want to put that needle down as soon as you stop. I am moving in kind of a looping pattern. There are lots of different patterns. I have a pin back here I'm going to be taking out, just like the straight line quilting. There are lots of different free motion patterns you can play with. Stippling is one that is popular to try to start with. And that's kind of like moving your needle kind of in a wiggly position back and forth and making kind of swiggles all over your quilt. And that's a very simple pattern. It's not one of my favorites. I find this loopy motion a little bit easier. So that's really what I prefer. And just because I'm explaining to you it as I go is why I'm putting the needle down and stopping. But you could just keep going as long as your hands can smoothly glide over the fabric and you can keep that fabric smooth. This is fusible foam in between, so it's thicker than batting, so it's giving me a little bit of that puffy look, and it's proving to be a little bit harder to free motion quilt with. But I'm going to do a few rows and you can watch me, and then we'll switch to the overhead view so you can watch that way as well. So just something to keep in mind is the speed you push your presser foot and the speed you move your hands determines the size of your stitches. So if you move slow, those stitches are going to be smaller, and if you move really fast, those stitches are going to be a lot bigger. And it's going to take practice to get to whichever you want to do. It took me a long time to practice and get to the point where I am comfortable with the size of my stitches. Also, coming to the outside edges can be a little bit tricky of your quilt, and I'm going to kind of take out a few pins. Once you get to the edge, you want to come down the side of your quilt in that 1/4 inch border so it's covered by your binding, or you could do a little back stitch, which would just be like sewing and moving it back and forth on that border, cut and then restart down. I don't really like to do that, so I tend to just kind of scoop my fabric straight down along the edge to the next spot. And because the new Star Quilt is the grid, we can do our loops within a row of squares. Or if you want to do extra large loops, you could do it within 2 rows of squares. You can start with the squares in the middle. So say this was our quilt. We would start here on this row across, and then we would do this row, and going the opposite side, we would go down from that middle row. Does that make sense? Just like straight line quilting, on your quilt, you want to start in the middle with your loops, which is very helpful in the New Star pattern that you have these rows to work within. If you're doing stippling, I would suggest starting on the edge of the middle of your quilt. Stipple as much as you can, working across the middle of your quilt. That takes you kind of in a random path. I would Google some tutorials on stippling quilting if you want to check that out. All right, let's go one more across, and then we'll go to our viewpoint from above. With the sides of the quilt, when you start, it's a little bit trickier because you have nothing on the side to grab. You will probably have a little bit of your backing and batting, which will help. But I find once you get over a touch is when it gets a little bit easier to maneuver and keep things smoothed out. You can see with this piece of quilted fabric, I am going back and forth in rows. If you're doing a quilt, it might be easiest to start with your whole quilt rolled up underneath and work this direction so that all this rolled up fabric slowly comes out this direction. Because it is harder to get the fabric to bunch up while you're quilting into this throat space, but it's kind of up to you. Practicing and finding out which works best for you is always the best option. My loops are being a little bit crazy going in this direction. But definitely, yes, because once you get only so far over, I definitely prefer to come from this point and quilt that way, but have my fabric move this way. Okay, where I have you overhead now, I'm going to take out my first pin because it's right there. Ideally, you would have a little container to put them in. And I will show you my process from up above. So we need to come down the length a little bit. I am doing hopefully about the same amount per loop, but I know I'm getting a little bit off just because I can't see super well under here just because it's not a huge machine, and my fabric being foam, maybe not the best choice. The Hemingway pouch that I'm going to be using this for calls for fusible foam, and I've made it with a couple different things. I've used headliner, which is very similar to fusible foam but a little bit thinner. I've used fusible foam, and I am going to try batting with that one. So I want to see what I like best. As I come to new sections of this, it's going to kind of open up, but I want to just make sure my fabric is smoothed across all layers. And you can see my hands, as I'm holding them, are kind of in this position the whole time, shifting every time I want to kind of move. The benefit of a machine with more throat space underneath here is that you can potentially get 2 loops before you have to move your hands. And I could potentially do that without more throat space, without it being fusible foam. This foam just takes up so much space and more manpower. So you can see that row, and probably from up above, you can probably tell if these are relatively straight or not, which is the beauty of the New Star quilt, having these squares and having rows, is that will give you a little bit more of a guide. What I'm going to do, because I prefer quilting from one direction than the other, is I did a back stitch. I'm going to cut that, and we're going to go back to this side and start over on that side again for our next row. And as I do this, I can just kind of roll this up. You can just hold it into place. You could get clamps and kind of clamp it into place. If you watched the tabletop basting video last week, you could use those clamps to kind of clamp this and move those clamps as you need to unroll the quilt. There is definitely a lot of fabric that ends up in here. So when I'm starting again on this side, I'm going to just do a quick locking stitch on that 1/4 inch border where my binding is going to cover it, and then I can work my way out from there. If you forget to put your needle down when you stop and your fabric shifts, because we're free motion quilting, as long as it didn't shift a lot and you have a lot of extra thread, you can just shift it back so your needle is about the amount of a stitch length from where it comes out of the fabric. Isn't this fabric so cute? I got both this lobster and crab fabric and the seagull fabric from Sewtopia recently on my trip to Utah, and these fabrics are both by Dear Stella. I probably wouldn't use them in a quilt. I might use the seagulls in a quilt. The lobsters are a little bit too much for me, but they're perfect for fussy cutting or for pouches or like a bag project. So I knew that I wanted to make a couple Hemingway pouches out of them. I keep some needlework projects in my Hemingway pouches now, and I wanted some funky ones, so I thought I would make these. So I can tell that I'm getting a little bit askew here because I have less space on this end than I do on this end. Not a ton, and it's fine because it's loopy, it's organic, but I just want to keep that in mind because I want to definitely have enough for 2 more loopy rows. Maybe 1 would fit. So if you are quilting where you don't have a grid pattern like the New Star, just kind of measuring and keeping an eye on the size of your loops. And that does come with practice and time as well. I am definitely better now than I was in the past at that. Okay, let's talk troubleshooting. What happens if you get some bunching or ripples in your quilt as you're quilting it? And I did have a little issue there. So I'm actually just going to pull this out and show you because this is a good example. My thread didn't catch, and so it had a very large stitch, and then I caught it as I'm coming back. So there's a couple things you can do if you run out of thread in the middle of a stretch of straight quilting. You can do a couple things. Always, you're going to have to unpick a little bit. You, though, would unpick your threads back to a point where you can restart. You're going to bury those threads at that point, and then you're going to start again. And I will show you how to do that. I'm actually going to unpick back to here, maybe back to here, and then I'll show you how to restart a needle, and you're going to have to bury those threads at the beginning. Okay, I am picked enough that I can smooth out that wrinkle. And so I have these tails where I want to restart. I'm going to bury these threads at the end of that line by just doing my knot, and I usually do 2 to 3 knots. I'm going to trim these down so they don't have any of those rough edges, and I'm going to feed them through. Because I'm nice and close to this edge, it's kind of great. I know that I can just pull those threads out the side and I don't have to worry about burying them fully. If I didn't have this close to the edge, I would poke my needle as far in as I could before I rocked it back up. And then I would pull the threads all the way back up, pull them taut, and clip. And that way, when you let go of that tautness, they'll pull the threads back underneath those layers. Now, because you're up here, I am going to tell you what I'm going to do, but you're not going to be able to see it as easily. I am going to take my needle and I'm going to drop it directly on top of the end of that thread. I'm going to hold the top thread that's coming out of my needle itself. I'm going to hold that to the side, and I'm going to do one needle up and down while holding my thread. Or you can move your wheel to drop your needle down and come back up. That's going to pull the bobbin thread up through your layers onto the top. So I'm aligning my needle. And you do maybe want to use your wheel a little bit just to make sure your needle goes in right where you ended your thread. Holding on to this thread to give it a little bit of tautness, you want to pull this back up, and that's going to pull up your bobbin thread. And you want to be careful to make sure you get your bobbin thread up, and then you can kind of pull it out to the side. Now, I'm going to sew a little bit first, and then I'll bury my threads because I'm under my machine. To sew, I want to put my needle back down pretty much on top of where those threads came out, just a tiny bit away, and then I can start sewing. That way, it will look like my line of quilting is continuous, and I won't have any thickness there from backstitching or lock stitching. So remember, if you have to restart some thread somewhere, or you're doing that to smooth out some fabric, just remember to make sure that you're doing the smoothing before you get started. One last pen to take out. If you feel comfortable, sometimes you can rotate your fabric to do your design so that you have less fabric in the throat space. So that's kind of a trick you can try, but sometimes if you're doing a specific design or direction of a design, I know not everybody feels comfortable rotating the fabric. Sometimes I go as far as rotating it upside down. Doing my design sideways can be tricky, but typically doing your design up and down is a very similar movement to going right side up. At the end of your quilting, you just maybe lock stitch a few stitches so that your thread doesn't start to unravel there. And of course, do that in your binding 1/4 inch border space. So we have this panel quilted now. You kind of got to look at how to free motion quilt. I'm going to pull you in close to look at that burying of the thread at a closer vantage point. So I think you can see here where my two tails of thread come out where I started my new stitches. That's also where I ended my stitches. So a closer look at this is taking my needle and of course a larger eye. This is the eye of your needle. Something that's easy to thread is ideal. Putting that needle in right where those stitches come out, and I'm going to come into the side. Since I'm on the edge here, like I said before, I could just go to the edge, but I'm going to come up to the side so you can see what it looks like to pull the needle through the layers. I like to clip my thread so they're the even length, and then it helps to wet them a little bit. You can kind of lick your fingers and use it, or lick them directly in your mouth. It's kind of gross, but that wetness pulls down all the thread fibers and makes it easier to go through. So I'm gonna thread these through the eye right there, pull them out, and the more thread you have here, the easier it is. But if you have a little tail, just work with what you have. My needle is already in. You can see it's not coming out the back. I have it just going into the batting, and I'm going to poke my needle in as far as it will go before I kind of rock it back up, and then continue pushing and pulling until your needle's out. It just kind of came out in one fell swoop. And I've got these threads over here. It looks like one of the threads kind of pulled off, but the other is still out there. You can see I pulled it tight enough that there's not really any major bubbling there. And then I want to pull it slightly taut and then clip it as close to the fabric as I can, pulling the thread away. And that means that if I'm pulling it tauter and clip it, after I clip it, those threads are going to pop back into the fabric. Worst case, if they don't pop back in, use your finger to wiggle kind of back and forth, and the threads will fall under the fabric. You can see there, that's a pretty seamless transition of thread. I do see a little bit of a knot there, and that's probably my own fault, but it's pretty seamless there. So I have a little makeshift setup here to show you some hand quilting. I am not an expert. I try to keep my hand sewing very simple, so I wanted to just show you, but encourage you to look up some videos of actually people who know what they're doing. So this time I'm trying this thread. It's a wonderful Egyptian cotton thread, 12 weight. I love the look of a big stitch. This is the same thread, just with the thing on and without the plastic on, but it's the same color. But this is what it looks like. I have used Aurifil 12 weight, pearl cotton. I'm going through a bunch of different 12 weights and even slightly larger, I think 8 weight threads, to see what I like the best for hand quilting and big stitch binding. Remember, the lower the number, the bigger the thread. So there's that. I just grabbed this needle. I have never found a great needle yet for hand quilting because I use the thicker thread. So you just want it sharp. Typically, I think people like a little bit of flexibility with hand quilting, but as long as they're sharp, that's handy. The last thing that I have that I love are these, and I'll put these in the blog post as well. It is a thimble. It's a sticky leather pad, and they're reusable, and I just put it on my finger where I tend to push the needle through. So I really like these. I've tried tons of different thimbles and I just think they're clunky, and I prefer this. So for the New Star quilt, I am going to do some diagonal quilting across, and it's very nice that we have these squares like I was talking about with some of the other types of quilting, that we can just kind of sew point to point. So I'm going to go across a short end for you. Again, even with hand quilting, I would suggest working from the middle of the quilt out, but just for, video's sake, we're going to do this. And I'm going to show you. So I personally love 2 strands of thread, and then I knot them after I thread them through my needle. But I know that's not typical. Typically, you would do 1 strand of thread. And the trick with hand quilting is when you have to restart in the middle of a row is that you need to bury your thread. So how you do that is you just kind of use a little bit of force, and I'll restart this because I'm on the edge and I can access. So if I was going to start in the middle of a block, I would push my thread through for my first stitch, and that's of course a big stitch, but we would do like a longer, from where I want to start, I would put my tail back a little bit if I can, because when you get to your knot, you're just going to kind of pull till that pops through, and it takes a little bit of force, yes. And then you can kind of use your fingers to smooth that out. So that is how you start. So that works best with thinner thread or one strand of thread with one knot, because you want your net to be small. If you are going to use thicker thread with a thicker knot, I would recommend trying to stop and end at a point where you can access where the knot is from in between your layers, which is a great reason for you to do from the middle out, because you'll always have excess if you do from the middle out, and you will have less fabric piled up on one end. Luckily, because I am starting on an end here, I can start it just going in from underneath instead of popping my knot through the fabric. So let's hop over here to the end. Now, because I'm doing straight stitching, I personally prefer no hoop, but, and you could use a hoop with this as well. Just a large hoop is good. Something that is holdable in your hands, or you have a stand, and then maneuverable. Because I'm starting at the edge, I want to remember my binding is here. So I want to start my stitch at the end of my point for my HST. I don't want to start that stitch at the end of the seam, because that's not going to give me a nice straight diagonal line. This corner here where the point is where my actual end of block corner is. So I'm going to tuck it in from underneath along the edge, and then you can use a Hera marker and a ruler or a fabric marking pin to mark a line to follow straight along. And that's probably great for the beginning of your hand quilting experience. I do love to just kind of wing things, guys. So I like to kind of look at a trajectory by pulling my thread across like that. And then I just kind of wing it. Once you get going with your thread, you can kind of see where you're going, and you are going to want to move your thread out of the way. So the trick with hand quilting is the rocking motion. It's great to get multiple stitches on at one time. Let me see. I'm trying to make sure you guys are seeing what I am doing, because it's hard. So you want a rocking motion. So let's pull that all the way through, and then we'll try again. So keeping your stitch length a similar length, you want to put your needle straight down ideally, and then you want to rock it back up and poke it through using the finger behind to kind of guide and feel about where you want to come up. And then you're going to poke your needle out about the length of your next stitch, and you're going to rock that straight down and then come back out. And do the same thing. Feel from the back where your needle is going to come up. And this will, again, take practice to get the stitch lengths to be even and uniform. I love the look of hand quilting, and I like it to have a little bit of a handmade messy vibes. So for me, I don't really mind if my stitches aren't perfect. But again, if you do, it's just something you can put practice into. You can definitely see my line isn't going to be perfectly straight, but I think it's kind of just trying to show you guys as I'm doing this. But that rocking motion is where it's at with hand quilting. And after I pull my stitches through, sometimes there can be a little bit of a gather, because we are basically doing gathering stitches here. So just going back along your line somewhere and doing a little bit of tug to smooth that fabric out will really make a difference in how tight your stitches feel. And my needle goes in farther than my stitch, and I use my finger behind to kind of feel my needle sliding back a little bit to get that stitch length perfect. The goal is for your stitches to be the same size on the back and front of your quilt. So you can see here the stitches on the back are pretty decently similar size to the stitches on the front. If you are not putting your needle straight down, your needle is going to go through the top layer, and then if you're putting your needle at an angle, it's going to go through the bottom layer farther along, and then when you rock it back up to get the same stitch length on the top, your stitch length on the back is going to be minute. I can even feel it with my finger. That, while a similar stitch length to the rest, because of the direction I put in my needle at an angle, the stitch on the back is like minuscule. So that is why we put our needle down from the front perfectly straight, and then we use our finger to guide the needle back up at the proper stitch length so that we get as close to the same size stitches as we can. And really the goal is to get a lot of stitches onto your needle, as many as you can really comfortably fit, and then pushing your needle through all at once. If you watch some videos online of people who are super good at hand quilting, they just kind of sail through this technique. It is kind of amazing. Something to keep an eye out for is as you're pulling your thread through, sometimes if you have two threads together, they can get uneven in how they align. So keeping an eye for that. If you have any bubbles, you just need to kind of straighten them out. This thread, this Wonderfil thread, is actually the best thread I've had in terms of that situation. It is not getting any of those extra little bubbles in there that sometimes I get with cotton threads like Aurifil 12 weight, or I forget another 12 weight I used, but it was like a rayon 12 weight, and I kept getting bubbles in my thread, so one thread was coming out longer than the other. And it's fine as long as you notice, and you can just switch it, or you can use some thread gloss, which is kind of like a wax that you rub across your thread to, like, I guess, just keep it from sticking too much. So very similar in terms of setting up as machine quilting. You can use a Hera marker and your ruler to mark a grid. You can use templates and a fabric marker to mark different designs. I've seen some people doing some pretty clamshell designs lately that are lovely. Just takes a little bit of prep. And then 2 strands or 1 strand. You can even use regular quilting thread to quilt with. I just think you have to understand you won't see those stitches as much, which maybe you want your stitches to blend in. And just using a sharp needle, and if you need a thimble to help you push that thread through, this leather thimble is a really great option for just pushing the end of that needle, and it doesn't feel like anything is really there. I'm going to get to the end, and then I will share with you how to knot your end off. So I am just making sure the trajectory of my needle is coming out straight from the existing line that I've already sewn. And as I rock it back, it's staying along that same trajectory, which automatically puts my next stitches in the proper trajectory. So I don't really have to worry too much about how straight my line is going from point to point. And as you're quilting, feel along the back for any folds or wrinkles that could hinder you from having a nice smooth back, which is what a embroidery hoop can help with. I just like to have this hand really close to what I'm working on. And so therefore I would need a hoop that has a stand where I can put my hand underneath and not have to support the hoop. And those are not inexpensive. So that is one of the reasons I just do it like this without a hoop. It's a little bit different where cross stitch you don't need your hand on the back to help you. That's the other instance, cross stitch and embroidery, I guess, that I would use a hoop. Okay, so we're coming to the end here. So I have enough thread. What I would do typically is I would just put my needle through for my last stitch or two. And once my needle is going to come up in this 1/4 inch section of the edge that my binding will cover, I'll just pop my needle through there and knot it in the batting. Do a couple knots in the batting or one knot in the batting, and that will hold it, and then you can clip it. If you're in the middle of a row and you're running out of thread, this is what you should do. So say you have a couple inches left and you need to knot your thread and start a new one. You're going to start it just like I showed you where you bury the knot, but first you have to finish this one. So you're going to put a knot in your thread that's a little bit farther down the thread than your next stitch. So my next stitch should be about that size. And I put my knot maybe double that, maybe 1.5 times. And then I put my needle in for my next stitch. And I'm not going to go all the way through to the back like that. I'm only going to go through the top layer and maybe the batting layer. And then I'm going to pull my needle up somewhere else on the quilt. It doesn't really matter. And I'm going to then pull it all the way through. And I'm going to pop that knot into the fabric again. So therefore my knot has been buried, and I can cut this off just like when we buried a thread on our quilt top. I can cut this off, pulling it taut a little bit so it wrinkles this up so that when I cut it and let it go, it pulls that thread tail back into my fabric. So we have a nice finished end, and then you can literally start your next stitch right where you would start your next stitch. So that's kind of a little light overview of hand quilting. You can see on here, my stitch line isn't the best. Like, I would probably use a guide and do some guidelines just to get it nice and straight. But that's a very simple overview. I'll put the supplies of my little thimble, and I really like this thread, just stitching that. Probably one of the best hand quilting threads that I have quilted with yet. And I'll put these needles in the blog post as well, so you can take a look at those and decide if that is what you would like to use for your needles. I would love to hear what you do in terms of quilting. If you're going to hand quilt, if you're machine quilting straight line, machine quilting a pattern, or if you're sitting to a long arm, just let me know on the videos or in the blog post.